Well, thank you for joining me in another study of the book of Isaiah. I'll ask, if you will, to please be turning to chapter 36 as we're going to continue looking at this new section that we began last time, looking at chapters 36 through 39, where we're seeing a historical bridge. We had a section that took us all the way through chapter 35, and then beginning in chapter 40, we're going to have another major section begin. Last time, we looked at, again, the historical background of what we're seeing here. We see that Hezekiah became king about 715 BC. And then 14 years into his reign, or about the year 701 BC, we see that he was attacked by the king of Assyria as he rebelled against him. Chapter 36, we began looking at this Assyrian threat throughout this chapter, and this is what we want to complete. Verses 13 through 20 is where we'll begin here. And then we'll move into chapter 37 as we continue to look at this concept that was surrounding Sennacherib's invasion of King Hezekiah. Remember back in verses 4 through 10 that Rabshakeh was arrogant, he was boastful, and he was basically belittling Judah. And that was because of the greatness of Sennacherib. What could Judah hope to ever accomplish? How would they ever be able to get away? You might remember that Daniel chapter 3 portrays a very similar scenario where Nebuchadnezzar required the Jews to bow down and honor, pay homage to an idol of himself, an image of himself that he made. And of course, we know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the ones that were involved in that setting, in that scene there in Daniel 3. And in that concept, remember, Nebuchadnezzar basically asked the question, who is the God who could deliver you from me if you don't do my will? And there we find that great statement of faith. Our God is able. But even if he chooses not to, we're not going to bow down and worship this image. Well, let's picture Rabshakeh as doing very much the same thing here. Who do you Jews think you are, that you might think that you might avoid this situation? So let's look at verses 13 through 20 and look at the second speech of Rabshakeh. Isaiah chapter 36, and we're looking at verses 13 through 20. Excuse me. Then the Rabshakeh stood and called out with a loud voice in Hebrew and said, Hear the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you. Nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, saying, The Lord will surely deliver us. This city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, Make peace with me by a present, and come out to me, and every one of you eat from his own vine, and every one from his own fig tree, and every one of you drink the waters of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your land, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards. Beware lest Hezekiah persuade you, saying, The Lord will deliver us. Has any one of the gods of the nations delivered its hand from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? Indeed, have they delivered Samaria from my hand? Who among all the gods of these lands have delivered their country from my hand, that the Lord should deliver Israel from my own hand? Well, again, look at the arrogance there. Now, of note, this is delivered in the Hebrew tongue. Rabshakeh wanted the people to understand what was being said. He thought the people were giving too much credit to and leaned too much on Hezekiah in this time. This revolved around the word deliver. In verses 14 through 20, the word deliver is used 7 times. Again, basically what he's saying is, nothing can stop Sennacherib. When he sets his mind and when he sets his course here on Judah, nothing's going to turn it around. You see, he had all the confidence in the world and the arrogance and the pride that went with it on King Sennacherib. He was speaking with the authority of King Sennacherib, and he was looking down his nose, condescending as it related to others. And through all of these situations, he's looking at the Jews and he's saying, don't pay any attention to Hezekiah. Don't pay any attention to what he says. Bottom line, Rabshakeh was presenting the false narrative that Hezekiah was providing them false hope because the God of the Hebrews would not be able to avert what was going on. In that sense, he bragged that neither God nor Hezekiah would be able to deliver them from Sennacherib's approach, from Sennacherib's hand. Again, we think of Daniel chapter 3 and the arrogance of Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, he was the world power at that time. He had conquered many at that time. Numerous nations had fallen to him, and he had been given no evidence that the gods of anybody else were any stronger than his gods. And that's exactly what Rabshakeh is doing here. As a matter of fact, he's going to go back and have them remember all these other people that have fallen, they've had gods too. But where are those gods? And why did those gods not prevent what was promised by Sennacherib? Well, then in verses 16 through 18, he tried to sell them, if you will, on how good things would be in captivity. Remember, he said, it's going to be kind of like your land here. Remember when the Jews were coming in to take this land after the 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Even as they went up to the area and the 12 spies went in, they were promised that it would be a land flowing with milk and honey. And then all 12 spies came back and said, indeed, that's right. The land is everything God said it would be. But there's giants there and we're grasshoppers in their sight. But the land was plentiful because it was God who had blessed them. Well, now the same argument is being used for Rabshakeh to try to turn them away from bowing up against Sennacherib, from falling in behind Hezekiah and having their faith put in God and the God who provides. Rabshakeh says, where you'll be going is not much different than what you have here. There's abundance there. You'll be able to eat there. Things are plentiful there. Their own historical records, however, paint an entirely different picture of what that area was like. They're talking about atrocities that happened at the hands of the Assyrians. The Assyrians abused all of their captives because they could. They were dominant. They were domineering. They were abusive. But Rabshakeh was trying to paint a picture. Oh, it'll be great. It'll be nice. You'll enjoy yourself here. We'll take care of you. Don't put your trust in Hezekiah. So what he was doing was he was using deceit while at the same time accusing Hezekiah of being deceitful in claiming that God could deliver them. Now let's remember who we're talking about. When we think about two powerful kings of Judah, the names Josiah and Hezekiah moved to the top of that list. Both of those were reformed kings. Both did a lot of good. Hezekiah had his problems. He's going to have a problem here later. But the whole point is, this is not just a suit, if you will. Hezekiah was indeed a good leader, and Hezekiah had his place at this, his faith at this point placed squarely upon God and the promises that God had made long ago that he would take care of them. Well, there in verses 19 and 20, as pagans, they attributed their riches and their power to their pagan gods. Being monotheistic in nature, they thought their gods were more powerful than anybody else's gods. They acknowledged the existence of the gods of other people. They just said that they were weak in comparison to their gods. And as he lists all of these cities, all these different places, they had their gods, and those gods that we know were really no gods. But in their mind and in Assyria's mind, their gods were not able to overcome the power of the Assyrian gods. And Rabshakeh saw nothing different here. He's going to learn a lesson, as is Sennacherib. But at this point, there is no respect for the God of heaven because of their past, what they had seen. They saw the God of heaven, the only true God, as being inferior to the gods of Assyria. To them, God was just another god among many. Well, let's now move to Hezekiah's reaction, beginning in chapter 36, verses 21 to 22. But they held their peace and answered him not a word, for the king's commandment was, do not answer him. Then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, Shebna, the scribe, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the recorder, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn, and told him the words of the Rabshakeh. To their credit, notice their recognition of the sovereignty of Hezekiah here, because of the authority given to him by God. They didn't answer Rabshakeh. They didn't fall prey to the arguments. In obedience to Hezekiah's command, they did not answer Rabshakeh. You see, Rabshakeh was doing everything he could do to cast doubt upon their situation. However, this incident right here, these two verses show us that Rabshakeh failed. He was unsuccessful in driving a wedge between the people and the king. Everything that Rabshakeh was stupid is not in that list. He knew what he was doing. He had negotiated before. He had been adept in that capacity, apparently, as we look at their track record. But here he failed. He did not understand, and he underestimated the relationship of the people to Hezekiah. And in this scene, we're going to see great evidence regarding the power of the true God. But now this was still a troubling time. You see, they were trembling, if you will, and it's understandable. Look at the track record that Assyria had had. They were the world power. Just 20 short years prior to this occasion, they had defeated and carried off the 10 northern tribes into captivity. This was 701 when this was happening. So they already had evidence as to how powerful Assyria was. And if any of them were still having idolatry problems themselves, then maybe they had a little bit of fear about the possibility of the God that Sennacherib said took care of him. And so what we're told there is that they responded with silence and mourning. They stood up to Rabshakeh, but we don't see a confident people here. We see a people who are sad, they're down, likely depressed, fearful for what's laying ahead. Shebna and Eliakim went to Hezekiah with their clothes torn. That was not a good sign. That was not something positive that was done. They were concerned about the situation. Well, look at Hezekiah's response in chapter 37 and verse 1. And so it was, when King Hezekiah heard it, that he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. Oh, what a powerful example of a powerful leader at this time. Hezekiah's response was that of penitence and prayer. Remember that throughout our studies so far of the book of Isaiah, a recurring theme has been don't trust in the nations around you. Put your trust in God. So as a leader leading God's people, what a powerful depiction of the faith of a man who is leading by putting his trust in God. Look at verses 2 and 3 as it relates to word that he sent to Isaiah. Then he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, Shebna the scribe, and the elders of the priest, covered with sackcloth, to Isaiah, the prophet, the son of Amoz. And they said to him, Thus says Hezekiah, This day is a day of trouble and rebuke and blasphemy, for the children have come to birth, but there is no strength to bring them forth. So Hezekiah went to pray, and then he sent word to Isaiah for Isaiah to pray, a prophet of God, recognized as God's emissary, God's ambassador, God's spokesman. He now wants Isaiah to do an intercessory prayer on behalf of Hezekiah and God's people. He acknowledged that it was indeed a trying time. It wasn't a pretty picture. Let's not forget how horrible Assyria could be, how bloodthirsty and cruel and spiteful. They would not take any mercy on these people. Just as they led others away into captivity with a hook in their mouth, they would do the same thing to these people. They had manifested over and over again how cruel they could be, and these people had seen those. They may have known some who were involved in a very similar situation. But confession of sin, penitence, should always precede petitions for help. Hezekiah did not plead for help until he was penitent himself. When we're penitent, we get back in good standing with God. And then we have the ability to approach God in prayer. Note that Hezekiah here, and I think this is again is a powerful concept regarding how strong Hezekiah was and how faithful Hezekiah was. Notice that Hezekiah asked Isaiah to pray for the people, not for him. He approached God himself. But Hezekiah, as a leader of the people, was concerned for the well-being of the people. He was concerned that the people were down, that they were depressed, that they were troubled, and he was pleading for Isaiah to pray for them, that they could be strengthened. As a true leader, any true leader, he's concerned about his people. I'm so thankful to be working under an eldership that is so clearly concerned for the people. That's what it's about. That's why God established that position. Shepherds to care for, to feed, and to guide the flock. You can't do that effectively if you don't care for the people that are in your charge. It's the same way with us as preachers or any other faithful Christian. We're concerned about others, and hopefully more so than ourselves. We look out for the interest of our brethren, and sometimes we'll take being done wrong. We'll take the high road because of our concern for our brethren. So many examples, so many tangents we could go off here, but let's continue. Look at verse 4. It may be that the Lord your God will hear the words of the Rabshakeh, whom his master the king of Assyria has sent to reproach the living God, and will rebuke the words which the Lord your God has heard. Therefore, lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left. The remnant of who? The remnant of God's people. Remember, 10 tribes had already been carried off. We're the only ones left. Benjamin and Judah, those last 2 tribes, are now what's left of God's people. The 10 northern tribes have been carried away by Assyria. They had already suffered at their hands. But Hezekiah is very careful to note here the gravity of what had happened with Rabshakeh. He had blasphemed God. Rabshakeh as the representative, as the envoy of King Sennacherib. Sennacherib also had blasphemed against the God of heaven. Oh, it's so interesting here to note the difference between two kings, father and son, Hezekiah and Ahaz. Back in chapter 3, remember verses 2 through 13? Even though he was given the sign that the Davidic line would continue, he still entered an alliance by paying tribute to Assyria. But son, Hezekiah, is not like the father, Ahaz. He put his trust in God. He realized the power and the importance of prayer and what prayer could do. And he also realized that that kind of prayer, just knowing that people are being prayed for, gives us courage. When I was doing mission work, one of the congregations that supported me was Bridgeport. And in my reports, emails, I would let them know when I was about to leave the country. And some of the most comforting emails I ever got was while I was overseas. And this was from the Bridgeport congregations, and others like them said, we're lifting your name before God in prayer. We're praying for your safety. We're praying for your success. We're praying for the success of the gospel. We're praying for the seed to be sown. And that encourages. It strengthens. It bolsters us, even when we may have doubts of our own. The remnant refers to those left after Sennacherib's destruction. You see, also part of Judah had also fallen to Sennacherib. Several cities had been taken, but the nation of Judah had not been taken as yet. There's still some left. And Hezekiah was praying for their benefit. Well, now in chapter 37, verses 5 through 13, we have the Lord's first assurance. We want to see answered prayer that's provided here. And so let's look first of all at verses 5 through 7 and look at the return message that Isaiah had for King Hezekiah. So the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, and Isaiah said to them, "Thus you shall say to your master, Thus says the Lord, do not be afraid of the words which you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Surely I will send a spirit upon him, and he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land. And I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land." Well, Isaiah, again as a true prophet and in this situation, wanted to calm the fears of God's people. Anxiety, fear, dread, these are all things that should be removed or at least tempered and handled whenever we put our trust in God. Do we live in trying times today? Yes, we do. News of COVID over and over concerns us. News of the decline in our morality. Attacks against those who are trying to live good, moral Christian lives. Those are difficult times. And the times are not going to be removed. Until we get to the end of the time, from New Testament on, we know that there are wheat and tares. We know there's tares in the world. We know there's difficulties in the world. James says we ought to be glad for the difficulties because they allow us to grow in our faith, the temptations that we face. But as we pray to God, we should at least be comforted. God's in control. God's going to care for us. And if we will remain faithful to our covenant with God, our part of the covenant that God established, then God likewise will be faithful, Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10, to bless those. So therefore we can be comforted even in times of difficulty, and that's what was going on there. Isaiah was saying words that were designed to provide confidence in those who trust in God. Isaiah knew that fear had a paralyzing effect. and he sought to dispel those fears. When Isaiah there indicated that they should all fear the Lord, there in verses 5 and 6, what he was talking about was maintaining their reverence and their awe of God. Don't allow what's going on to put doubts in your mind about the God of heaven and that of which he is capable. Now look at verse 7. Surely I will send a spirit upon him, and he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land. And I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. What's Isaiah saying? What's Isaiah telling God's people? Yeah, Rabshakeh's boasting. He's blustering. He's arrogant. He's rude. He's condescending. He's convinced that they're weak and do-nothing people. And Isaiah's basic message was Sennacherib is not going to succeed. He's going to fail. He's going down. His efforts are going to end in failure. His assassination 20 years later would completely fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah. Well, we have another section here in this chapter, verses 8 through 13, but I think I want to stop there. I don't want to get halfway through that and have to interrupt it. That's a good closing thought with another message that Assyria is going to send them. Then in chapter 37, we're going to continue to look, verses 14 through 20, at Hezekiah's prayer. And then in chapter 37, verses 21 to 32, we're going to look at the Lord's second assurance. All of that's going to be seen in chapter 37. I want to thank you again for joining us here in our study of the book of Isaiah. I hope that you can see that the Old Testament provides a basis for a lot of trust that we have in God. We're looking at how God dwelt and dealt with his people. We're looking at the promises of God, and as the people were remaining faithful, we see God following through with what he has promised, and there's so many lessons we can learn. It is difficult to be a Christian today. We are in the vast minority, in a world that is wicked and growing even more wicked. And we might be tempted to put our trust in government or programs or this or that. We need to learn the same lesson that Ahaz was taught but refused, and Hezekiah was taught and accepted, that the only possible way that we can flourish in our present society is to put our trust in God and in his word and his leaders. May we do so, and may we be those who are found faithful as it relates to God and his will for us. Until next time, God bless you.